This is Your Morning Basket, where we help you bring truth, goodness, and beauty to your homeschool day. Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 65 of the Your Morning Basket podcast. I'm Pam Barnhill, your host, and I am so happy that you are joining me here today. Well, today is our final archive episode of the podcast. These are episodes that first appeared on the Homeschool Solutions show in 2018, and we are bringing them over into the canon, so to speak, of Your Morning Basket. And we've kind of saved one of the best for last. This episode is with Cindy Rollins, who I like to call the mama of morning time. She has turned an entire generation of homeschool moms onto the concept of doing morning time or morning basket in their home. And I wanted to have Cindy on to talk about a book that is fascinating to both of us. This is Stratford Caldicott's Beauty in the Word. If you haven't read this one, I highly recommend it. And today we're going to be talking about grammar as remembering. And it's kind of a concept that Caldicott takes a little bit of a different take on than is normally heard about in classical circles. So some of the concepts we're going to cover are the idea of anchoring or tethering our children to a cultural heritage and how you can use morning time to do that. Why is this important? We're also going to be talking about the connection between language and memory and how language helps form relationships with ideas. It's a really wonderful conversation. I think you're going to enjoy it, and we'll get on with it right after this word from our sponsor. This episode of the Your Morning Basket podcast is brought to you by A Month of Morning Time. Now, A Month of Morning Time is our special sample set of morning time plans, and it's 3 whole weeks of morning time plans scheduled out for you. But knowing how homeschooling is and how we often have things that come up in life, we don't want to stress you out. So we call this a month of morning time. You can stretch those 3 weeks out into filling up an entire month. Now, there's also a loop schedule in this special set of morning time plans that you can follow as well. Inside the set of plans, we have a lovely selection of different things you can add to your morning time. Some bedtime math, a whole bunch of information about Bach and the Brandenburg concertos, some chalk pastel art, and a little bit about some really great artists like Michelangelo and Da Vinci. There's so many wonderful things in here. Just a lovely collection of beautiful things to add to your morning time. All laid out for you, all ready to go. All you have to do is collect a few books from your library. So if you are interested in downloading this sample set of morning time plans, head on over to pambarnhill.com/month or click on the show notes for this episode of the podcast. And now, on with the show. Cindy Rollins is the mother of 9 grown children with a passion for equipping families to practice morning time and homeschool for the long haul. The recipient of the 2016 Russell Kirk Paideia Prize, Cindy is the author of Mere Motherhood, as well as A Handbook to Morning Time. She joins us on this episode of the podcast to talk about morning time and remembering. Hey, Cindy, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Pam. I'm so happy to be here. It's always fun to talk to you.
It is always fun to have you on. And we're going to talk today about like one of your favorite topics, aren't we?
Absolutely. This is, if not my favorite topic.
So tell me a little bit about how you got introduced to Beauty in the Word and Stratford Caldicott and this idea he has of remembering.
Yeah, well, I guess it was at a CERSI conference that I must have heard Stratford Caldicott's name bantered around. And I know it bantered around for a couple years in my mind before I actually settled down to read Beauty in the Word. And I really didn't know what I was expecting out of the book. It certainly wasn't what I got. It definitely, I thought I was going to read something a little dry, a little confusing, as most educational treatises from scholarly men can be. And I just, the first section of the book just absolutely changed my life. And it was as if he took everything I intuitively knew and finally turned everything up, put the puzzle together and made everything fit properly, especially when he started to talk about the trivium, and he talked about what we called the grammar stage really being what he called a remembrance stage, or remembering. So that was huge for me at that time, because it wasn't that what he was saying was new. I mean, it was new, but it was actually just like a piece of the puzzle I had been missing. And it cleared up so much of why I was at odds with some forms of classical education, where the trivium was, the first stage of the trivium was called the grammar stage. And many people took that to mean that means we cram as much in the head as possible, as far as facts and lists and all these things, and rather than and things the child knows nothing about, rather than through stories and poems and wisdom and literature and music and singing. It was just a life-giving way to look at the trivium.
Yeah, and this actually made a huge difference for me. And then he goes on. So this chapter, the chapter that we're specifically talking about, is that the quote unquote grammar stage chapter, which he likens to remembering. And then he goes on and he does the same with the dialectic stage and the rhetoric stage as well. And, talking about those in completely different ways than I had ever seen them talked about. So he goes through the entire trivium in the book and really kind of turns it on its head. But I think, he calls dialectic knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually flipping through my book right now. And then speaking is the rhetoric stage. And like you, I was just really blown away by the idea that this idea of grammar is more than just facts, more than just thinking about facts. And my chapter is full of so many things that I've underlined.
Oh, yes.
So talk to us a little bit about how this idea that Caldecott puts forth about remembering being distinct from and yet still connected to some of the connotations that we might associate with memory, such as recall or memorization.
Right. Well, it's not like, so we had this idea of the trivium is a grammar stage, and there was some memorizing going on during that time previously, but it wasn't a life-giving memorization. It was really a kind of a disconnect. So Caldecott basically takes it back and says, no, this is what the grammar stage is for. It is for actually remembering beautiful things. And those things are building the foundation. It's still a foundational level, but the foundation, rather than being a pile of facts, it is that you're memorizing, is so many beautiful things that you're still kind of memorizing. You're still memorizing these things. I'm a big fan of memorization. I think there are very few things as helpful in at any age than memorization. Even as older people, memorization is still extremely helpful in our lives. So at every turn, I think memorization is the foundation of whatever we are doing. I wouldn't teach a child almost every subject you could throw in some kind of memory thing, and not just, we're in biology, so we're going to memorize this, or let's say chemistry, because then it's easier, or anatomy, we're going to memorize the bones. When you're older, you're doing those things, but there are even beautiful things apart from that you can memorize as a whole, and not as, in other words, as Karen Glass would say, we can memorize synthetically rather than analytically.
Yes. Oh, and so like you're talking, and I'm thinking about the quote in the book where he talks about how, well, he's talking about Plato, and he says that, memory has been stripped from us, and all we possess is an external reminder of what we have lost. And this was like this next little backhanded part. He said, enabling us to pretend to a wisdom and an inner life we no longer possess in ourselves. And so he's saying if we don't have this remembering, if we don't have this memory, then we're just kind of pretending to knowledge here.
Yes. And I think that is very true. And I think that you see that going on a lot. In, real education and real knowledge should produce in us a humility. So when we see education not doing that, or when we see a form of, like, say, classical education or intellectual education, or even the reading life that produces a kind of a know-it-all, arrogance, or how can I one up you? I've read more than you have. Then that's not at all what we're looking for. What we're looking for is going to humble us, and it's going to be something that brings us life, and not the death that we get when we're. Actually, I read this morning, I was reading a devotional I have, and it's by Tim Keller. But he says here in the prayer at the end of this January 8th day, Lord, help me to avoid the world's shortcuts to looking wise, the cynical air, the inside joke, the sighs and feigned sadness about how stupid everyone is. Let me despise no one and respect everyone. And I just thought that was a really appropriate for what education, how education can go wrong.
Yeah,
if we're not careful.
Very much so. Okay, so we're talking here about a deeper kind of learning. We're talking about a remembering or a recalling. And you speak about this, and you write about anchoring and tethering our children to a cultural heritage. So I'm kind of moving now from what memory is to what things we're supposed to be remembering. And Caldecott talks about memory and tradition as ways of passing down culture and joining generations together. So what kind of cultural heritage are we talking about? What did you work to pass down to your children through morning time? Are we talking about go ahead.
No, go ahead. You ask. I'd like to hear what you were going to say.
Well, are we talking about like the Christian tradition, American heritage, Western civilization, all of the above, or something else entirely?
All the above.
Okay.
Both all of those things, and also the poetic tradition. All of these things we're going to bring to to the memory. I think most children should at all times have maybe 3 pieces of memory going at a time. I don't think that's too hard. They don't have to get through them in a 6-week period. They could take, a half a year or a year to memorize if they had to. But I still think it does the brain good to have different types of memorization. So a child might be memorizing the First Amendment, and he might be memorizing, the first 10 verses of Genesis, and he might be memorizing a poem on top of all that. So I always thought it was important to have kind of a 2-pronged memory, the Bible, poetry, and then something that was cultural, tied into the culture, either the culture of the church. You could do a creed, you could do all kinds of things like that. A prayer that you hear that sounds beautiful. We did the West Point Cadets prayer. It's a beautiful prayer for boys. And, that was just a cultural heritage, because when you're memorizing these things, you're hearing them over and over and over again. And you're also picking up things about the past. I like to say that the past has a DNA that is locked into these words that we're memorizing. So as we're memorizing, or even singing a folk song over and over and over again, suddenly there are words that we wouldn't know that take on life. There are whole cultures of people that become embedded in our soul that we understand in a new way that we might not even know that we know, and that will feed us the rest of our lives. So I just don't think there's much that we do that bears as much fruit as that.
So you're saying that, you have these 3 pieces of memory work going, and it's okay if they don't get it quickly. It's okay if this takes a while for them to actually kind of master the piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And some kids are going to master things easily, and some kids are never going to master them. They're going to have worked on the piece for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, and still, miss a word here and there consistently. That's okay. That's okay. We don't have to insist that we don't have to ruin the experience for that child, because he's still getting all the benefits of having those words in his heart, even if he doesn't have them word perfect. So.
Okay. And so at that point, you would give it a time, and when they had it mostly good, you would move on to the next one because they've gotten the idea from that piece.
Exactly. That's what I would do. I wouldn't kill it, because we're not belaboring the piece. We're not over and over talking about it and just killing it. We're just saying it each day quickly and going on. We're moving on and letting it do its own work. And that's how I feel it should be done. There are times when everybody at once is like, well, what in the world does that mean? And we can look it up. But for instance, when you're doing to be or not to be, you can go for months or weeks going, who with Fartles bear, who, I forget the line, but who knows what that means? And no, you don't have to look it up right away. You don't have to be like, oh, let's look this up. Sometimes you might want to do that. And sometimes you just might want to let that sit in the mind, because that's what the mind is going to work on. Looking for that, trying to figure that out. Let the mind do the work, not the mom.
Oh, that's a really good
quote. I just said that. I'm going to copyright that now.
I'm writing it down right now so we don't forget it. I love that so much, because so often, especially with scripture and harder pieces of poetry and things like that, we want to, provide the answer for our kids and tell them what it means. And, so I think that it's okay to kind of let them chew on that. Now, I do think it's important to make sure they're saying the right words.
Yes. Yeah.
Because if you've ever heard a kid butcher the Lord's Prayer or something like that, they can get way out of left field with what they think you're saying.
That is true. You can have all kinds of weird theological mistakes going on when you get to totally miss out on what the point of the word is. And kids will do that frequently. So it's hard to correct them sometimes, but yeah, I think getting the words right is good. It's a good thing, definitely.
Yeah, but they don't necessarily. It's okay if they don't 100% understand everything that they're saying, because that wisdom is going to come to them over time. Right now, they're getting those words internalized.
Yeah, thinking about that, I think about when I go to church, sometimes they'll sing a hymn, an old hymn, and somebody will have decided to update the wording so that it makes more sense to modern audiences. And I just feel like that takes all the intellectual meat out of the hymn. That hymn was written a certain way by the author, and when we don't quite understand the wording, it makes it interesting to us, because then we think about it. And our minds work on it. And I just feel like it's super sad when somebody thinks that to make the line simple will improve the hymn. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. That's making me think of another situation that's going on right now with the Lord's Prayer, or the Our Father. Mm-hmm. Apparently, and I don't know the whole deal, but I'm Catholic, and so the Vatican has come out and said what's the line? Lead us not into temptation. So you're asking God to lead us not into temptation, and they're saying that the wording on that one should have been different all these years. And
Mm-hmm.
because God would never lead you into temptation. And so
Right.
I'm just in here going, oh, this is going to take some pondering on my part as to whether or not I'm ever going to be able to say anything other than lead us not into temptation, which I know it's kind of a different thing, but it's like,
Well, and it is true because it is like, there it is hanging, like God doesn't lead us into temptation. It says that clearly in the Bible. And yet
yeah,
we prayed that all this time. Did we just intuitively understand what it meant
right, right. Yeah,
without
I'm still
worry about it too much?
yeah, I'm still chewing on that one. I'm not quite sure. What my feelings are going to be.
Yeah,
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 a hard one. But it's like they're changing something or clarifying something that has been that I've said for all of these years. And I think I did know that, it was never that God was going to lead me into temptation. But so even though I haven't been, yeah. So anyway, it's interesting.
Yeah, we could really get messed up here if we started
That's
saying
what that made me think of. And I could probably get
yeah,
into
yeah.
trouble. So.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right.
All
We don't
right,
want
so
to
let's talk about cultural heritage. And you've
Okay.
kind of touched on this a little bit already, but what do you think our cultural heritage is made of? So if a mom's listening to us and they're like, okay, well, I kind of like this idea of using memory to pass on cultural heritage to my kids. And we talked about Christian tradition and American heritage and Western civilization, but can we get more specific? What are some things that bind us together? And, I know scripture is definitely going to be one, but what else?
Well, I mean, we said the creeds, the Apostles' Creed. I think, what is it, the Nicene Creed? Which is
Uh-huh.
the creed that we all can agree on?
I think it's the Catholics do both. We do the Apostles and the Nicene, but I think the Nicene is the one that is said in like more traditions.
Right, right. And there are some great memory things from American history. There's Thomas Paine's "These Are the Times That Try Men's Souls." When you start reading, especially when you go back in early American history and you start reading the Declaration of Independence, maybe the first part of it, or the preamble to the Constitution, and you see this sentence structure, and you realize how highly intellectual these men were, and their facility with language was incredible. And it just makes us better people to know that we are a little dumbed down. That this was a different way of speaking and writing, and it was very precise, and it helps us. It helps our children, I think, to see and to know, and it creates that humility once again that, oh, I'm not the end all with my little things I do. There are people that came before me that had incredible abilities, and by contemplating what they wrote, it can become a part of me, and that can have consequences.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that makes me think of the part in the chapter where Caldecott talks about, and he kind of likens this to us being, we don't need to remember anything because we can Google things. But
Yeah.
back and I think it was Plato who was the one who was complaining about the fact that people were writing things down.
Yes. Right.
And he was worried that by writing things down, Plato's critique of writing calls into question the whole myth of progress that shapes our view of human history. Caldecott just gives us those little zingers. But he was talking about relying on external marks on paper to call things to mind that will lose their capacity to recall things from within themselves.
Right.
So
right.
we are like saying, oh, now we don't even have to remember anything. We can just Google it. But even farther back, Plato was saying, hey, you're writing things down now, and you're going to lose something by doing that because we're not internalizing this stuff and remembering it inside of us.
Now, I think because we have Google, it's more important than ever for us to memorize, not facts, because we do have Google, but these other things, these other ways of speaking and looking at the world, the Western tradition, our heritage, and even sometimes looking at other cultures and other heritages and seeing the way that they looked at the world and the way they interacted with it. And yes, you're right. I think writing changes things. And, they even say, I heard a pastor say he didn't allow them to record his preaching because he said just the act of recording it changed it. So there is a lot there, and we can't go back. We can't, we do write, and writing is a great way to think, but it is also a great way to forget. And if the goal is remembrance, which is what Stratford is saying it is, and I fully believe he is correct, then to do the things that cause us to remember is very important, especially for our future, for the future, not just now. We have to hold on to the past as we go into the future, and we are going to go into the future. We're not saying we're going to, dress up in hoop skirts and, and pretend to live in another time. And I think homeschoolers have made that mistake before, thinking, well, we'll just live in a different time. No, we're not able to live in a different time, but because we are going into the future, we must carry with us the wisdom that has come from the past, because that's the only way we can get wisdom. We're not going to get it within ourselves if we don't look back.
Mm. Well, speaking of hoop skirts, and we're talking about on a cultural heritage here, how do you handle aspects of our heritage that are not positive or admirable?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And there are times when, well, I'll tell you how I handled it this year. This year I read 2 books to my student that had portrayals of racial portrayals that were awkward. One was Huckleberry Finn, and they used a word that I don't use in that book. And the other was Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which also used that same word in a different way and a more. In Huckleberry Finn, I believe Mark Twain's purpose in writing that were pure and good towards African Americans. But he wasn't an African American, and so I just changed the word. And that when I was reading it aloud, I'm not saying that a child couldn't read that word and understand the context. I would definitely have a conversation about it. I would not hand a child Huckleberry Finn without a conversation. But in Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, to take out that word would be to deny the pain and suffering that the family had faced. So we just kept the word in, and we talked about this. This is how bad it was. This is why this family, this is what they went through, and look at what great attitudes they have, and this sort of thing. But there are other books that definitely come from a much more a less innocent aspect of a different period of time. You can't change people in the past, and you can't make them over into what we think is right today, and what the values that we've had the luxury to have in our culture. Some of the values that we have are improvements, and we are doing better, and we do think more highly of one another, not basing it on our sex or our race. But that does not erase the fact that those people in the past also had wisdom that we may have forgotten. And so I try to be just, we don't have to whitewash what they said. We don't have to say, oh, this is good because they said it. But we can say, well, they had some good things to say, but they also, in their time, this was considered good. There were times when Christians, when evolution first came out, many Christians thought, well, it's a done deal. They didn't know there was, and so many Christians became evolutionists, even though they were still Christians. And we can't say, well, I'm never going to read that person because it looks like they liked evolution. We have to be broader minded than that. We have to see that they only had a certain set of information, and we have a different set. And we can learn from them, because if we limit ourselves to just books that are written in our time with our values, we are going to be severely crippled as we go into the future. In my opinion. What do you think? I mean, you might have a different opinion, so I'd love to hear that if you have it.
Well, you're making me think, and so I have to kind of process the information. It doesn't come out that quickly, but I think you're right, because you have to know the whole story. And so you can't limit yourself to one small piece of the story just because it's the piece that you agree with. You have to know the entire story in order to, make judgments and be part of the conversation. And so you just can't leave parts of it out. And so just because you read something or just because you experience something doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with everything about it.
Right.
I do think it's important to look at things from all sides in order to, to come up with your own thoughts about something.
Yeah. And there's very few things that we're going to agree with anyway, unequivocally, even now. I mean, things that are written now are not necessarily better for being pure. There is a point of no return where we've purified the truth right out of things. And that's a sad moment in time too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, as you're looking back on morning time and doing this for all of the years with your kids, what kinds of things that you did, what things do you think conveyed cultural heritage to your children? And I know there's just memorizing, but what else?
Well, we read aloud a lot of historical books. And when we first started, I didn't know the history. So I'm reading these very basic, maybe first and second grade books out loud to my kids. And I'm like, what? I didn't know that. And I think it was the time that we had to devote to those things. So we got a really broad picture of the heritage that we came from. Especially, we were very good at doing American history early on. And it wasn't until later years that we got into a lot of the ancient history. At the very end of my homeschooling career, I finally read the Iliad and the Odyssey out loud to two of my children. And it went very well with the American history that we had read. In fact, and that is also Plutarch. If you look at Plutarch, very much tuned in. You will not read anything in Plutarch that doesn't sound contemporary. Well, you might. There might be some weird things about sandals and stuff, but Plutarch is very relevant to our time. And you cannot read Plutarch without being aware that these were lessons that they learned in Roman and Greek times, and these are so not so different from what we are facing today in many ways. They have the same problems with their leaders that we have with ours. And seeing how they dealt with it can help us to, because sometimes when you're in a bubble, you think, oh, this is the answer, when really it isn't. And then sometimes you can look back in history and say, oh yeah, they thought that too, but it didn't turn out to be that way.
That's interesting. It's good to point out, and we have a podcast where Ann White comes on and talks to us about Plutarch and how to study Plutarch. And I think you've done an episode with her too. And one of the things that was fascinating to me was Plutarch was not history for Charlotte Mason students. It was actually like civics for them, right?
That's right. It was citizenship. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So Plutarch, that's a good one. And then you mentioned hymns and folk songs and poetry as well.
Right. Yeah. We did stories. We did a lot of, I think fairy tales. I know you've had Angelina on. Fairy tales are wonderful, different folk tales. I love to go into the library section because it's hard to cover all the folk tales that there are out in the world. But if you just go into that section of the library and you start looking at the books and pulling those looking through those. That was always my favorite section of the library. There's so many good books and stories in the traditional tales section of even the picture books. There's some wonderful picture books, and don't ask me to name them. I'm trying to think. My brain is, but there are like Paul Galdone. He wrote some really good. The Peter Shams wrote. Some of these are really old books, and I know many libraries have gotten rid of some of these traditional, beautifully illustrated stories. Shakespeare is something else that the more I grow, I'm still growing up in Shakespeare, but you can't help but, Shakespeare is so cliche because he has affected our language in a real way.
Yeah. And I think it's good to point out that, just to kind of reiterate, we're talking about memorizing here, but we're also, this remembering goes even deeper than memorizing. It's kind of this remembering who you are and your place in this grand story, this grand cultural story through stories, songs, poems. So it's not just memorizing, but it's also listening to those stories and hearing those songs and all of those things, not just the memorization.
And just having, beautiful music, classical music playing in the background is so important because, no, your children might not grow up to be able to say, oh, that's the Ninth Symphony or whatever, but they will have an appreciation for it because there's something about that music that speaks to our heart, and they will remember that it is good. And very few people actually hate classical music. I mean, at least if they listen to it at all, they don't.
Right. Well, Caldecott talks about the connection between language and memory and how language helps us form relationships with ideas and helps us put the pieces together and figure out the world. So how does this tie in with Charlotte Mason's writings about ideas, relationships, and spreading the feast for our children?
Okay. What did you say Caldecott said again? Let me get this clear in my head.
Well, he talks about the connection between language and memory and how language helps us form relationships with ideas and put together the pieces and figure out the world. Hold on, let me see if I could find that little section.
Well, I agree with you that, and I agree with you. I agree with him. There is nothing, I think that is what the grammar stage is for, language. I think that when we understand the point of the grammar stage is language, then that's where this whole idea of remembrance comes in and the whole idea of culture comes in. It is very, very important to have a strong foundation in language, in speaking and writing. And the grammar stage, you're not doing a lot of writing. The child is not writing things down. But he is remembering because you're asking him to remember what he has read, and that's a deep part of. And even before you're asking him that, you're reading your children's stories that they do remember and they do want to remember, and then the child turns around and takes all that, and if you give them time to play, then you will see the narration. You don't even have to have a formal narration. If a child is able to play at a young age when they're in this remembrance stage, you'll see this language coming out in their play. I remember my boys used to say, I'd hear them outside yelling, "What's over yonder?" And then somebody would say, "I need the blunderbuss." And, they'd be using all these really strange words. And I think, man, they're really weird kids. But that's what they did with the stories. They acted them out on their own after they had heard them. So Charlotte Mason is basically saying, if you are hearing these things and you're listening with attention, and because most of these things are pretty awesome, people do want to listen with attention, then you are going to recreate them in some way in your life as you think about them, as you ponder them, and as you eventually, you're going to narrate them but that's just a natural process. So we want those early years to be language heavy, language rich. Really, the whole point of the early years is to have the child interacting with words and ideas.
Yeah, there's a quote at the end of the chapter that I just love. He says, it's like, okay, could I please go back and do this over again?
Yes.
I could do the early years over again now that I've read this. But he says the first lesson of our revised trivium is therefore the vital importance of crafts, drama and dance, poetry and storytelling as a foundation for independent and critical thought. Through doing and making, through poesis, the house of the soul is built.
Yes, and then he goes on in that same quote, which is just really, really the heart and soul of everything he's saying. And he brings out the point that poetry, and I'm sorry I didn't already say this, because is made of images, similes, metaphors, and analogies. And that is how language changes us. And that is how language works upon us. When we compare, our feelings to something we see outside, that is a higher order of thinking. And a child picks that up effortlessly in this sort of education. So, they say, what is it? The Miller analogy test is the highest test for intelligence that they have. Analogies are not that hard for children who have grown up with poetry, constantly seeing language used in this way. Sure, they may not understand every metaphor, every analogy, every simile that they come across in poetry, but they're seeing language used that way, and it makes you have a heightened awareness that I got to pay attention. And when you get older and they throw an analogy test in front of you, which they don't do very much anymore because obviously people can't handle it, but say in the past they did, it's not that hard to do analogies when you have been looking at the world through that as a metaphor through language.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just to think about, going back to scripture, I mean, it's chock full of those kinds of things. So just to get prose, things we read, everything, these analogies are everywhere. And so the poetry is the kind of training ground for understanding so many other things that are out there. It's like the mental exercise part.
I always say that poetry to me is the bridge between the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium is language. If you wanted to choose some broad words, say the trivium is about language and the quadrivium is about mathematics. Poetry is the bridge, and music. Of course, music is very much a part of the quadrivium, and it is mathematical in many ways. But it is the bridge between those two things, between music and language. So poetry is a very important part of very few things besides Bible are as important as poetry because of the higher order of thinking and the delightful way it causes us to wonder also. And it leaves our brains just thinking. What, that's why we don't always want to tell the child what the poem means. Sometimes we can. Sometimes we can help them through so that the next poem they get to, they can do the work on their own. You go to bed at night, and I remember the reason I know this works is because there were a couple of poems I memorized over the years with the kids. For instance, and there were long poems. One time we did Horatius at the Bridge, which takes a full 20 minutes. Well, we didn't study that poem so much as we just said it over and over. But the more I went and the longer I memorized that poem, the more sentences made sense to me as I went. My brain couldn't take it all in at once, but eventually, that's a type, that's a place. Maybe I didn't even know it was a place when I'm tripping over all the weird words that I don't normally see. But eventually my brain, is able to say, okay, now I know what that word means. Now I know what this word means. And it's constantly working on it. So each day when I read the poem, it made more sense to me.
Well, and I think that brings up a very important point, is that it's okay if we don't get it the first time. It's okay if we don't understand it the first time. It's okay if we can't explain it to them. maybe we shouldn't even be trying. We just need to let it work on us.
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes moms can get so excited about what they get that they can kind of steal it from. I just read something C.S. Lewis said. I'm trying to think of where I read that. Oh, his letters to children, where he essentially said, I don't know if I can find it right now, but Lewis said something really, I didn't underline it because I was lazy, but a little girl asked him something about a poem, and he just said something really, really, not what you think he'd say, but rather what kind of along the lines of what we're saying right here to her. And I can't find it. So if I'd underlined it, I would have been able to find it, but I did not.
I understand. Well, let's talk about Caldecott describes the Hall of Fire in Rivendell from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy as the place where tradition is passed on through story, where meaning is revealed, where language expresses itself in the making and interpretation of worlds. How can morning time become our Rivendell, or our place of hospitality and rest, a place of story, poetry, and song?
Okay. Wow. I mean, when we're building a family culture, when we're doing stuff together, we're building a family culture. And I think that's extremely important. It is that whole, because you do share those things, they never can be taken away from you. When I talk to my children, now, and I say something, that we have a common culture and a heritage that, and you even see this breaking apart in our culture now. It used to be we would read books together, we would read poems together, or, of course, morning time does that, but in the culture. But then, like TV, radio came along, but still people were sitting around the radio together and listening to stories. But then later, TV came along, but still people were sitting around the TV. Everybody had their own TV, one TV in their home. But now, nobody comes home on Monday night and watches Little House on the Prairie all together like we used to do when I was first married. Monday night was my Little House on the Prairie night. My husband would come home from work, and I would be sitting there. He would get home about 8 or right when the show was over. And I would just be sitting there sobbing every week after the end of the show. Not because it's over, because it was just so melodramatic and sad. But there was this shared culture where everybody in the culture would say, oh, did you see Little House on the Prairie last night? And now we've lost that so much because we all can stream and watch something on our own. Now, we may find a tribe of people online that they're all watching this show together, but in our own families, we're all watching something else. And so we don't have that conversation. We don't have that fire, that great hall with a fire to transfer culture. It's becoming more and more and more fragmented. Everything that we do, all our stories are far, far apart from one another, and we don't have a common culture to share them with. I mean, when you think about, I don't know how many stories the Greeks actually had. We know they had the Iliad and the Odyssey, and maybe they had hundreds of stories, or maybe they only had a few. I don't know, but because that was their only entertainment, they all knew those same stories.
Yeah, that one will make you think. That is an interesting thought, that they all knew the same stories. And so that it was something that bound them together.
And even in the Bible, you hear Paul talking about stories that he assumed everybody knew. And we don't know them now as much, but he's speaking about stories and things that they were familiar with at that time.
I'm going to have to chew on that one for a while.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, oh, man, that's really good. I mean, I've talked about shared family culture before, and about, being able to kind of have that idea of, oh, so-and-so, no, we all know the same things. But I think it was like this moment that it struck me absolutely. how important this was, that our shared family culture and everybody knowing the stories is kind of a reflection of, this greater, like the Greeks, and everybody knew those stories. And so that's a cultural heritage that has lasted for so long and had such a huge impact. And was it because everyone knew the stories? Whereas if you look at us, where we are so fragmented and we don't have stories that everyone knows anymore, 1,000 years from now, what impact will our society have?
Yeah,
because we've lost that.
It really is something to think about, and to think, is there something we've replaced stories with? Is there something, or is it just that we're gorging ourselves on stories and we just have so many stories that they can't have any effect on us because we're, or the effect they have is not culturally as a group, but it is too fragmented, too far out. I like to talk about that whole thing of being tethered, like you say, and I got that idea when I was watching one of those weird movies in space where the guy got lost. He was he was tethered to the space thing, and it was George Clooney, so everybody will know this movie, but my brain won't come up with it. But he was tethered to the spaceship, and he got untethered, and then he was just lost in the universe. And it was just so profound watching it. It was also terrifying to think of, there he was going to live some more. I mean, he wasn't going to live very long, but he was going to live completely disconnected from everything. And I started thinking about how does that affect us? Is that our job, to put as many tethers into ourselves and our children? Because honestly, sometimes we don't have, even with our children, we don't have complete autonomy over them eventually. This is coming from a mom who has learned that the hard way. But we do, even for ourselves, it's important that we're tethered to the past so that we can move into the future, because otherwise it's just insanity. And I think we are seeing a little bit of that now as everything is untethered. You could say, we have this center, but all these stories have just flown out and they're just all over the place, and they're just like rocks in the air, like of the universe. My metaphors are going to get weirder and weirder.
Yeah, I'm going to entitle this podcast Deep Thoughts with Cindy Rollins.
Okay, sorry.
No, but just thinking about,
off the deep end.
No, but this is kind of our role, to tether our children, and that we are. I mean, there is a lot of untetheredness, or a lot of fragmentedness. And yeah. And I think that just brings me back to the quote from earlier, and now I'll have a hard time finding it. But Plato's critique of writing calls into question the whole myth of progress that shapes our view of human history. We think we're so, we've progressed so far over these old cultures, but maybe honestly we haven't.
When people say to me, do I have to have morning time? Which I always find to be a really odd question. No, you don't have to have morning time. That's your choice altogether. But when I think about these things, I think, yes, you have to have morning time. If you want to preserve culture, this is a really simple way to do it. No, you don't have to. There are other things you can do in your family that can preserve your culture. But if your children are all just off doing all their schoolwork all by themselves, each in their own way, and you're doing your own thing on the computer or whatever, there are times for that, and that's good. But if that's all that you're gaining out of homeschooling, then you are missing a huge philosophical gap there. And that's why, reading aloud is a start. I mean, even if you can't pull off a morning time, you can hopefully you're pulling off reading aloud one book to your family at a time. And that is another form of doing that.
Well, we're going to end on that note, because I think that's a fabulous apologetic for morning time. And we're just gonna let that hang out there and let people think about that one. So
Sounds good.
Cindy, thank you so much for joining me here today. You've given me a lot to chew on. It'll be a few days before I unpack all of this one in my head and think about it all. Tell everybody where they can find you online.
Okay, well, you can find me at cindyrollins.net. That's my new home online, and I'm on Facebook as Cindy Rollins, writer, speaker, encourager. I'm not sure how you find that on Facebook, but if you want to like those things, that'd be great. Or sign up for my new newsletter. That would be fantastic. I'm hopefully still tethered, but I'm moving out into a new adventure to see where I will head. So that's where you can find me.
And there you have it. Now, if you would like links to any of the books and resources that Cindy and I chatted about on today's episode of the podcast, you can find them on the show notes for this episode. Those are at pambarnhill.com/YMB65. Also on the show notes, we have some helpful instructions for you if you would like to leave a rating or review for the Your Morning Basket podcast in iTunes. The ratings and reviews that you leave help us get the word out about the podcast to new listeners, and so we really appreciate it when you take the time to do that. Thank you very much. I'll be back again in a couple of weeks with another great morning time interview. We have Alicia Greathouse and her daughter Olivia. They're going to be on the podcast with us, and they're going to be talking all about their brand new podcast, Masterpiece Makers. Now, this is an art appreciation podcast for families, so moms can listen, kids can listen, everyone can listen together. And it is just so much fun. So we're going to be talking a little bit about art appreciation, about this new podcast, and about how you can use it in your morning time to add a little art appreciation to your day. So we hope you join us for that. And until then, keep seeking truth, goodness, and beauty in your homeschool day.